Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered, and contribute to the community forum. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our construction, tech, or weekly Global Passive House Showcase webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to another episode of the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh coming to you from Auckland.
And I'm Zach Semke coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
And we are still on Christmas break, holiday time at the moment. I may or may not be relaxing on a beach somewhere at
this is being listened to. That sounds pretty nice.
Yeah, But it's great that we're able to still keep pushing out some podcasts. I don't know about you, but I quite like having some good content to listen to during my holidays.
I do too. I love to listen to my favorite podcasts during the breaks. It's nice.
Yeah, and I kind of get sick of people just republishing stuff, and it's like, oh, I've already listened to this one. Yeah,
that can be frustrating. We
got some new content.
We were guilty of that a little bit in the summer, but yeah, we're not going to do it this time.
Yeah, not now summer anyway. It's
right.
depths of winter for you guys in the Northern Hemisphere. But we're going to Sydney this week for a chat with Chris Nunn, who's been enjoying life in his very own passive house. But before we get into that, we do have some great sponsors to thank.
We do. Everything we do at the Accelerator comes thanks to support from our sponsors. So I want to give a big thank you, as always, to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingui Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minutair all-in-one HVAC and dehumidification units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, RDH Building Science, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Thank you too to our champion sponsors, Icon Windows and Doors and SIGA. And thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Awesome. Alrighty, Chris Nunn. I've been meaning to catch up with Chris for a while, and very pleased that I did. Quite good timing as well. And you should definitely do a little search. You can probably find it fairly easily, but we might put a link as well. He's put a great video up of the construction of his own home, and then a tour. So there's a time lapse of the construction, and then he does a great fisheye selfie stick tour. Nice. Going through his house. So have a look at that and you can see all the details of what we're talking about. But by way of introduction, Chris Nunn is a sustainability advocate who's done a lot of work to bring Passive House to the mainstream attention, mostly in Australia, but in this part of the world, really. At the time of our interview, he was just completing a very successful 4-year term as the chair of the Australian Passive House Association. And as well as overseeing the significant growth of Passive House in Australia during that time, he's sort of culminated his experience of Passive House with his very own project, which is in a suburban Sydney suburb. And it's an amazing project. It doesn't look particularly amazing. I think if you drove past it, you'd probably miss it if you didn't know what you were looking for. But that in its own way is, I think, significant because it's another demonstration of just how applicable Passive House is to all climates around the world. And in the case of Sydney, it really shows how those concepts of insulation, airtightness, and good ventilation can work just as well for keeping cool as they can for keeping warm. I should also note that Chris is part of his professional life is in finance and real estate. And in the back of my mind this whole time is just how incredibly exciting that is to have someone with Chris's passion and now his experience in that world of finance and pretty high-end real estate, commercial and residential. So here he is. Here's my chat with Chris. All right. Hey, well, thank you, Chris Nunn, for joining us on the show. It's awesome to have you as yourself, but also as a now proud homeowner and resident of a passive house. You got the plaque, right? You're all certified?
I do have the plaque. Claire Parry, the certifier, has sent me the plaque in the mail, and I've got a list of things that Jamie the builder and I are planning to just touch up after living in it for a few months, and putting the plaque on the wall is one of the jobs I've got for him. Yeah. So it's cool. I'm excited to put the plaque on the wall.
But do you put a passive house plaque on an external wall? Is that a?
Yes.
Is that a?
Yeah. It's right on under the front doorbell, proudly displayed next to the door handle.
But you're not going to penetrate your airtightness barrier by.
No. And I mean that's one of the great things about the construction system we've used is there's a 40mm batten separating the cladding system, the WeatherTech's cladding, from the airtight membrane, or it's actually the weatherproof membrane on the outside. So it's really just an extra rain screen. And then there's the insulation, and then the airtight membrane's on the inside. But to your point about puncturing the membrane, likewise on the inside, when you're hanging a picture frame, that would be a risk if you had the membrane up against the plasterboard. So there's a 40mm batten there as well. So you can put a screw through the plasterboard like normal, and it won't touch the membrane because it's set out by 40mm with a little batten.
Yeah. Do you know what number passive house you were in Australia?
In Australia, I was number 38. And so there's 38 buildings, not all houses. There's a multi-unit apartment block, 11-unit block called the Fern. There's a 150-bed student accommodation building at Monash University, and their new teaching facility called Woodside, which is their engineering and information technology building. And then there's lots and lots of houses now. Well, not lots and lots, but the rest are primarily houses. But they're starting to see scale, right? We've got Glenroy Community Hub, which is a library. So we're really starting to see passive house break out of the homes market into other kinds of buildings where, of course, it works equally as well.
It seems like it's a neck and neck for numbers in Australia and New Zealand. If you look at
they've been ahead of us for a while. Yeah, they've been ahead of us for a while, and they've had the benefit of people like Cara Rosemeyer, who's one of the very early passive house proponents, living and working there, and people like Elron Burrell, who's the current chair of the board of the New Zealand Passive House Association. He's a passive house architect and has worked in the UK for Archetype and other firms who are doing amazing passive house work, in the UK. And so I think they've had some real leading global experts, kicking things along in New Zealand, which is awesome. And they're starting to see scale as well. There's a really excellent co-living project in Dunedin. I don't know if you've seen that one, but beautiful development. Great story about residents coming together and buying a block of land and building their dream sort of co-living community.
Yeah, and there's a few other people looking at that project as well from other co-housing groups, but also the local council, which is awesome because that's what we need more of is more social housing, which is starting to see that come through.
Yeah.
So let's talk about
one other thing about the numbers is that I looked up because I'm also a Passive House Premium. So as you probably know, there's Passive House Classic, there's Passive House Plus, and there's Passive House Premium, and they're essentially varying levels of energy generation on top of the normal Passive House criteria. Passive House Plus has some renewables, and then Passive House Premium, you need to generate more renewable energy than you use over the course of a year. So we've got a big 20 kilowatt solar panel, and that's feeding more energy into the house and into the grid than what you use over the course of a year. And it means we can qualify for this Passive House Premium, which we've got. But I thought, how many of them are there? So there's only 3 of them in Australia. And
Right.
it's actually, as far as I can tell from the International Passive House Association database of projects, there's only 17 of them in the world.
Wow.
So I'm one of 17.
Yeah.
3 in Australia and one of 17 in the world. So
Nice.
pretty cool. That made me feel pretty good when I saw that.
Australia's be pretty, and New Zealand would be pretty well set for Passive House Premium because you've got a lot of sun.
That's right.
And we also don't have to go crazy with half-meter thick walls to protect us from minus 40 degrees in the winter.
Exactly.
So it's actually not that hard to get down below your 15 kilowatt hours and then to start generating above that.
Yep, absolutely right. I think that's why 3 out of 17 is not bad for, little old Australia versus 80 odd thousand around the world already built. So absolutely right. I think it is our more favorable climate that means, and greater access to sunshine. That means that we have an easier pathway to get to Passive House Premium, which is really exciting. And I think that's a message that hasn't quite sunk in yet in Australia, is that people see Passive House as a difficult European standard. Well, because of our more favourable climate relative to Europe where it originated, it's a lot easier to do here.
Yeah.
And it's actually not that big a deal. Once you learn about airtightness and you put in an MVHR, the insulation levels are not over the top relative to, what people are used to.
I think that's such an important point, that it's the performance on the inside that's the transferable bit that is common. What's uncommon is what you need to do in order to maintain that. So we absolutely want the same level of comfort and relative humidity and temperature inside. It's just that we don't have to do as much to achieve that consistently. One thing we do have to do is protect ourselves from overheating.
Yeah,
which I know that you've done a little bit on that and pay close attention to that. Let's get into your house. How's it been?
Yes.
So you've been in there for how long now?
Almost 5 months. So June. So it's been good. We've lived through a winter and it was delightful, as you'd expect.
And I'm guessing you've spent a bit more time in there than you intended, probably at the.
That's right. Well, I love it. I love being here, and so I've got an office in the front of the house, and it's on the ground floor, and it looks out to the garden, and so it's actually been lucky in many respects that we were able to finish our construction just before the second COVID lockdowns happened in Sydney. So we got the building finished prior to restrictions affecting our construction timetable, and then the supply chain issues that came with that and are now bedeviling some of the projects that are sort of midway through. So we were lucky there, and then we were lucky because we spent a lot of time in a really high quality space and got to know it, and it was good.
Describe the location where you are.
Yeah, so we're on the northern part of Sydney. Hornsby is kind of the regional centre where we are. We're in a suburb called Asquith, and it's on the northern train line. And that's really why I chose it. I've got family here. My parents are in Chatswood West, which is in the northern suburbs of Sydney as well. And my sisters are Ryde and in inner city. So I was looking at geographically where can I afford to buy a block that I can then knock down something down and then build the dream passive house that is close to a train station and has a reasonable door-to-door commute time. I work in the city, so I wanted somewhere near a train. And I just looked, I took 2 street directories apart and made this enormous wall map and drew circles around train lines and future infrastructure, motorways, and how's it going to work. And, I sort of did this geographical analysis of, I wanted to be within 5 minutes walk of a main train line and keep the door-to-door time about 45 minutes max, which it is for me. And so, that's where I've chosen. I'd never really even been to Asquith before. I grew up in Sydney and I'd never heard of the suburb. I've never been to the suburb, but based on this analysis, I was like, you know what, this could be a good option for us. You just got to get a bit realistic when you're buying houses in Sydney because of the price.
Oh, yeah.
And you just need to sort of put all your preconceptions from your childhood about suburbs aside and look afresh at your city as if you were coming to it as a foreigner, which was lucky for us because we'd lived over in the UK for 6 years and, we're used to kind of where are we going to live and making decisions like that from, from a sort of practical perspective. So, we put all our preconceptions aside and jumped in and bought a house in Asquith. And, it's great. It's 4 minutes walk to the train station, 350 meters, and door-to-door time 45 minutes.
Nice. Yeah, we bought our house where we are in Auckland based on train stations, so it's a good way to go. It's quite good coming to a city and not really knowing anything about the suburbs apart from if there's a decent school there and good public transport.
Yeah.
What's the climate like there?
Yeah, we're 180 meters above sea level, and it's a Sydney climate, so it's warm but not even as hot as Melbourne actually in summer. So it does get into the 40 degrees Celsius range, but not for particularly prolonged periods yet, although I expect that to happen with climate change. And winters are relatively mild in the sense that our minimum temperature is around 7 overnight at its coldest, so it's not particularly extreme by any sense of the imagination. But because of the quality of housing that people are used to in Sydney, which is poor, everyone I've ever met who's come to live in Sydney from somewhere else has said, I've never been as cold in Canada, in Germany, wherever as I have in Sydney over winter, because it's miserable. The houses don't work and I'm freezing in my own home. And notwithstanding that it sounds mild by global climatic standards, it's not snowing and minus 30. Well, anything below about 18 is miserable if you don't have any way to stay warm. So it doesn't really matter so much what the temperature is. It's, are you able to stay comfortable? And you're not in most Sydney houses.
For our North American friends, that winter low, 7 degrees, that would be about mid-40s Fahrenheit, and 40 in the summer Celsius would be over 100. It's about 105. Be getting right up there. But like you say, growing up in Adelaide, the thing I remember about that heat in the summer is it sometimes not going below 30 at night.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can kind of handle 40 degrees during the day because you just stay inside. But if it cools down in the nighttime, you can flush the house out. You can go and cool down. But it's the summer nights when it stays above 30 degrees where it gets a bit miserable.
Yeah, and we actually had temperature and humidity sensors in the house that we lived in on this block, the 1950s weatherboard, basically uninsulated, single glazed, really poor quality house that we lived in. And the data from that was very interesting in that, you know, when it was 7 degrees outside, it was 12 and 10 inside, you know?
Yeah.
And because of the really poor quality of construction, you know, open floorboards on brick piers, uninsulated subfloor with gaps in it, single glazing, aluminium frames, insulation, a little bit of insulation in the roof, nothing in the walls. It is miserable in there.
Yeah, we call that a wooden tent.
Yeah, absolutely right. They are wooden tents. It's really sad that we put up with that here. And I guess that's the sort of blessing and a curse of a mild climate, is that people haven't, you know, had the sort of physical need to stay warm like they do in Canada and Europe. So they haven't actually demanded quality construction.
I think that is the source of our problem collectively in Australia and New Zealand, that we kind of get away with it each winter. We think we're getting away with it. We're actually causing a lot of respiratory disease and asthma and illness.
Absolutely,
but because we almost get through, we just put on a jersey, put the heater on, whatever. We've just become used to really crappy houses. And I think that is part of the problem, that we've relied on what we think of as a mild climate. But like you say, if it's below 15 degrees Celsius or even 18 degrees Celsius inside, and also high humidity. You know, it doesn't take much for the relative humidity to get right up there at those low temperatures.
Yeah, we had the temperature data that we had showed that in winter, the bulk of the time it was between 15 and 20 degrees inside. And that was not through lack of effort in terms of heating. You know, we had, you know, big kilowatt sort of radiators on the wall trying to heat the space, but because it was so leaky and so inefficient, you actually could not maintain temperature. So most of the time it was below 20. A lot of the time it was 15, which is miserable inside. And then quite often overnight it was 10 and 12 in the bedrooms and in the kitchens and living spaces at nighttime.
And I bet you'd be getting some nice condensation on the inside of the windows.
Miserable, absolutely awful. Yeah. So, you know, the condensation, of course, would build up, particularly in the kids' bedrooms and our bedroom, and then condensation would run down the single glazed panes and accumulate in the rubber seal around the aluminium frame and cause black mold, which is, a real respiratory health concern. And of course, we'd clean it, but, it doesn't work. It just builds up at a faster rate than you can possibly eliminate it.
Did you consider trying to do a deep retrofit of that existing house?
No, I actually bought it with the intention to demolish it. And I was kind of looking for the worst house I could find so that I could...
Worst house on the best street.
Yeah. And
anyone would think you've got something to do with finance.
Yeah, I work in a big real estate company. I have heard that adage. And yeah, it's a street of similar houses. Some of them are, modern-ish, 1980s era brick houses, but a lot of them are these 1950s and 60s, fibro or weatherboard, really old houses. It's an area that's rapidly gentrifying for the same reasons that I chose it. There's a huge amount of construction going on in my suburb because it's one of the few areas in Sydney where, it's got those geographical location factors. It's a safe, nice suburb with schools and daycare and gyms and close to shops and close to rail, and houses, which, it sounds ridiculous to say this, but, $1 million to 1.2 million is considered affordable in Sydney.
Yeah.
And,
or at least average.
At least average, right? So, so that was the kind of price I paid in 2016 when we bought the house, and, prices have fluctuated a bit. But it's still there or thereabouts to buy a house in my area. So, yeah, look, that was the kind of cheapest thing I could get where I was like, no regrets, I'm going to demolish this and build the passive house, because I think that's the key choice that most people face in an expensive city is I'd love to be in the inner city, where I went to uni and be close to friends and pubs and, cycle to work. And I love all those things too. But, if you want to build a passive house, then you've got a big bill to pay for construction, or any house. You want to do any building, you've got a big bill to pay. And so you need to think about affordability, and therefore you need to think afresh about where you're prepared to live.
Is that scalable? Is that the way forward for places like that? Or is there a pathway for doing retrofitting? Or do you think there are just some houses that are too far gone? When we look
I
at
actually think the majority of
the
the Australian housing stock will be demolished and it will not be refurbished.
Is that a carbon problem?
It is. It certainly is. But it's also a, human health, comfort, well-being and efficiency issue. Are people going to be prepared to spend $2 million on a product that does not work?
Yeah.
No. I don't think so into the future. They're going to demand more. So I do think a lot of it should be demolished. And yes, it's a carbon problem, but, with timber construction and, for us, we've got, LVL frame, we've got, smart wool insulation, we've got WeatherTex cladding, which is a reused waste product from the Australian native hardwood timber industry, pulped and then pressed into a cladding system, which is durable. This building is as low carbon as it could be. So I think as long as people do all those things, then you've minimised the problem of the wastefulness of demolishing something and starting again. But, ultimately that has to happen when you've got a massive technology change. And that's what Passive House is. It's like saying, well, should I refurbish my Model T Ford, or should I refurbish my horse and cart so that it can drive on the streets today? It's like, well, no, it's too far gone. Sorry, you're going to need a new product because it's just so fundamentally different to what is there. And so, look, some heritage listed, European buildings and, buildings with a lot more sort of character, maybe, okay, there's a case for preserving facades, but frames and, subfloor and roof trusses and, maybe not. Maybe they do have to go. You certainly can do it. There is the NFIT standard, which is designed specifically for applying the Passive House criteria to deep retrofits, but it does require a very deep retrofit. You have to be prepared to, rip apart your walls and put new insulation in, likely, or, there are solutions which overclad apartment buildings, for instance, in Europe. So there's larger scale solutions that are less intrusive, but it does usually involve replacing the windows, because certainly in Australia, in Sydney, most of the windows are, thermally unbroken aluminium or steel frames with single glazing. And that just does not work in our climate. It's not fit for purpose. So, look, a deep retrofit is possible, but in many cases I do think starting again is the better option.
Yeah. I want to talk about your slab.
Yes.
For those, actually, before I go on, we'll post a link to the video because you've done a fantastic time lapse combined with a walkthrough showing a lot of the highlights of the video, which is awesome because I think a lot of that similar type of video that I've seen to date has been a little bit European or North American. So it's really great to have more and more examples of a more Australasian vernacular of passive houses. You mentioned specifically that the concrete slab is uninsulated from the ground. Why is that?
We looked at that really closely. It was my assumption going in that we would have an insulated slab, which is common, certainly even in Melbourne.
I've been preaching insulation on slabs for like the last decade.
Yes, so. And normally it's a great idea, but that's one of the magical and clever things about Passive House is it has this incredible software tool, the Passive House planning package, which is a really sophisticated set of Excel sheets with lots of formulas in them, maintained by the International Passive House Institute, a German building physics research body, who look at how this predictive model performs against actual, and then are constantly doing a feedback loop to refine the model. So it's had sort of years and years of evolution in terms of being a great design tool. And when you put the numbers into Passive House planning package, it showed, and we looked at the two options of a insulated slab and an uninsulated slab in the Passive House planning package. This was Andy Marlowe, the architect, doing these calcs. And it showed that the cooling benefit of a slab on ground in Sydney outweighed the energy benefit of an insulated slab in winter. Because the Passive House envelope, the walls and the roof and the rest of the house and the double glazing perform so well, the heat losses through the slab to the ground in winter were not as significant as the beneficial heat losses through the slab into the ground as a free cooling factor in summer. So we got this enormous cooling benefit in summer from having a slab on ground in Sydney, which was one of the really interesting, I guess, revelations of the design process that I wasn't expecting.
One of the things I really like about that is that it demonstrates that how site-specific Passive House can be, even using the same tool and using PHPP.
Yep.
But how it's not a case of one size fits all, but you can design to a location and the outcome might be slightly different. Because I would never have guessed that not insulating the slab would be a good idea.
Would be a good thing for a Passive House. That's right. It's not what you go in expecting, but I guess that's the great thing about an evidence-based design process supported by a software tool is that you can run the numbers and run a bunch of options and you can be pleasantly surprised because, a slab on ground is actually a much more conventional construction method in Sydney. Yeah. That's how most buildings in Sydney are currently built. So it's a great story for Passive House in Sydney in that, wow, actually this isn't any different to the way we build a normal slab. So that's the same. Okay. And that's a really nice thing for the industry to get used to and therefore not have to get used to more and more change. Like there's enough different things about Passive House for the builders and the architects to get used to already. So one less thing is good.
Going up from the slab, carbon light walls. We've had Burkhardt on the show, big fan of his work. Was that an obvious choice for you to use prefabricated panels?
It was, in that Passive House is still quite new in Sydney. At the time we were doing our design, there were no Passive Houses in Sydney. And, there was actually no one who was, really experienced designing and delivering a Passive House in my local market. When I initially sought out the help of an architect, it was, the only person I could find on the register of the database of Passive House certified designers was a guy who'd trained in Ireland and was now working in an architecture firm in Sydney. And so I went to him and anyway, we ended up taking more time to save up for the project. And by the time we actually came into the concept design stage properly, more people had got certified, but not a great deal more. But luckily, I'd served on the board of the Passive House Association and was good friends with Andy Marlowe by this time, and he'd, chalked up some experience and had got the ticket. But there weren't that many builders. There were probably 3 or 4 builders who we're looking at that would be able to build in my area that actually had Passive House certification, none of whom had built a Passive House before. And that's a long way around to saying, why did I choose Carbon Light? Is because that's a Passive House certified wall and roof construction system. And for me, that entirely de-risked the process. Well, not entirely, but largely de-risked the process of achieving Passive House certification with an architect and a builder with no experience, because Burkhart's thought through the methodology of making this system work and achieving the Passive House criteria, particularly the airtightness criteria. I really felt entirely comfortable that we were going to hit a good number because we'd used Burkhart's system, rather than the sort of risk of, well, we're doing a stick frame and we're putting the membrane up in sheets. It's like, you can do it, but it just feels like more risk to me because you're reliant on the skills of someone who hasn't done it before to understand the concept, and then
you probably have to go through a whole education process with that builder.
Yeah, and look, in the end, I think we could have done it the other way, and it would have still worked. There's another a lady, Ash, who works for Team Catalyst, who's like a green building design expert and did much of the modelling herself, who's just been through the process with a volume builder and actually, did the membrane herself and, taped it up. And it was actually a pretty conventional volume build, stick build. And, it worked, it passed. So you can do it. But for me, Carbon Light was a real sort of, I guess, comfort factor of, I know this is a really high quality product. It's a system that is guaranteed to work. So it saves about 2 months of construction time.
Yeah, was it 3 days?
3 days it went up from slab to, frame erect and weatherproof basically.
And is that roof panels as well?
Yeah, it was. We did the wall and the roof panels. Yep. Yeah. So they're all craned into place. They came on the back of a truck from Melbourne up to Sydney on a Monday morning, and, they started being craned into place and screwed together. And they had the first floor done, plus the first floor structure itself, the cassette floor, and all the internal partitions done on the first day. They did the second floor on the second day and some of the roof panels, and they finished the roof panels on day 3. And then on day 4, it rained torrentially,
Wow.
And so we hadn't even had the chance to tape the joins in the weatherproof membrane externally, and it did not leak inside. Like,
awesome.
The panels just fit absolutely millimeter perfect. It was one of the most satisfying things that I often talk about, is going up on the scaffolding. Is sort of the top of the roof apex is 8.5 meters above the ground, and running my finger across the 2 joining roof panels, and there not being a perceptible difference in height between the 2 joining panels at 8.5 meters. It's like, this is a beautiful thing. I can really appreciate the quality and the precision of this product. When I just saw it all come together with such precision.
Your panels came without windows, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Installed those on site?
They did, yeah. So the windows were sourced through Logic House, who are based down in Canberra originally, but also have a presence here in Sydney now. And, they were imported from Poland. They've got a supplier there who does these beautiful pine finger jointed. They're kind of actually an offcut. So the frames are made out of offcuts of other window frames, and then they're finger jointed together. So you see all these beautiful joins in them, which is something I like. So it's already a sort of a bit of a circular economy piece around making these high performance windows out of a waste product. They came on the back of the truck, and then they were installed after the frame went up, shortly thereafter, the next week really. And nice. So the panels came with the weatherproof membrane on the outside and the airtight membrane on the inside, covering those window openings. And then the builder basically cut the holes to suit with the lapping of the 2 membranes to allow the installation of the window into the frame, and then made all the airtight seals with the windows.
And I won't go through all the details, but I want to talk about your door, because I love the fact that you're very proud of your special front door.
Yes.
Why is it special?
Well, it's special because it's level with the ground. It's got, I think, less than half a centimetre rise over the door threshold. And we've done that because we wanted to make the ground floor of the house accessible to someone in a wheelchair or with any mobility issue, really. So there's this standard in Australia called the Livable Housing Standard, Livable Housing Australia, and it has a variety of certification levels, silver, gold, and platinum. And, the gold and platinum are for someone with higher needs. And because I was designing it for a theoretical possibility of someone with a disability living in the house, I thought, well, silver's probably good enough, and it's great. It specifies that you need a level threshold entry from, so we've got a concrete drive and path leading up to the front door, step free, and then a level threshold over the front door, and then wider doorways into the guest bedroom at the front, which could theoretically be a bedroom for someone in a wheelchair, and then an ensuite bathroom attached to that, which is also accessible. So it's a wider door. It's got more space in front of the toilet. It's got a wider area around the shower recess. It's got reinforced walls so that you could put grab rails anywhere in that room without having to strip the tiles back. You could just, make it adapted to suit someone's needs if they were in a situation of having a disability. And, that could be me. It could be my elderly parents who, are currently 73 and, are fully able. But, I'd love the idea of that they could age in place in this house with us. I saw them look after my granny, through to, she died when she was 92, but from about 85 through to 92, she had dementia and was living in my parents' house. And, it was a 2-story house with stairs, and, there were safety issues around having someone with dementia in that house. And I kind of wanted to make an environment where I could look after my parents as they age, or my wife's parents are also similar age and they live in Canada, so they could come and stay with us for 3 months and, they wouldn't have the hassle of, tripping up over a door frame. So it's a passive house door that seals beautifully, as all passive house products do, but it's got this lovely level threshold, and it's got these 2 little magnetic strips at the bottom edge of the door that kind of lift up as you lock the door and form the seal. So that's why it's a bit special.
I think the whole house is a really good example of accessible design done well, because it doesn't look like an accessible house in terms of, it doesn't have this big ramp out the front or anything. It's an inclusive design because it's designed for everyone, and it's not until you look at those details and think, most people wouldn't even realize that a standard front door isn't level until you're perhaps in the unfortunate situation of having to negotiate that either in a wheelchair or if you bust your knee and you're walking around with crutches after a football game or something. That's when you start to notice those things. So it's those little details, and I think a lot of people wouldn't think about how hard it necessarily is to have a level threshold that is also airtight.
Yeah.
And it's not until you actually think through the engineering of that, it's like, oh, actually, that's quite hard.
It's very clever, that door. And, there's a lot of things about building a passive house where you just go, oh, this is amazing. People have really thought about this. And you can buy these products that people have spent the time engineering a solution for that specific problem. And it's delightful that people have taken that care.
The house layout in general is quite beautiful, I think, in terms of its simplicity. Like it's the floor plan's quite simple, but it looks like a fantastic space to be in. You've got a beautiful kitchen looking out to the backyard and nice access from the front. I mean, driving past there's nothing that really says I'm a passive house. It just looks a little bit different because it's more modern from your 1950s neighbours, but I think it's a really good example of an emerging style of a passive house for a warmer climate. So having had a winter in there, how do you feel about going into summer now?
Yeah, good. I'm not worried. I don't think we're going to be uncomfortable in any stretch of the imagination. This is really one of the most high-performance buildings in Australia. It's got a sort of metre-deep external shading fin on the north elevation, which is the front of the house facing the street, plus a metre overhang eave on the roofline, which both shield the northern windows from the high-angle summer sun. So it's well shaded on the north where there's a moderate amount of glazing. It has a few small windows on the west, one high-level slit window in the master bedroom and one window each in the walk-in robe and the master ensuite, but they're small and they're not going to be an excessive source of heat gains. And then on the west, there's 2 windows. There's one which is a large, almost a sort of door-sized window that can be used to access the green roof for maintenance and to maintain the heat pump, which is located on the top of the green roof, which is above the shed. And then one of the bedrooms, the only window is a western-facing window. So we've got external blinds on that external glazed door window and the bedroom window on the west. So we've got these beautiful automated screens that can come down in the afternoon.
Do you know what your predicted summer temperatures are?
Look, without air conditioning, I expect it would get, above the 25 limit of passive house at some periods of the year, although I don't think significantly. I think it would maintain, perhaps 26 or 27. But I don't think we will want to do that. I think we'll just want to we've got 2 small split aircon units, one down in the the main kitchen, living, dining room.
Yeah,
and one up in the kids' rumpus room, which is living space on the first floor. And those 2 units are just set to maintain a temperature. And that's kind of how we'd like to live, is we'll in summer set it at, I don't know, probably 25, 26 or, 20, whatever we decide is a comfortable upper limit to our comfort zone. And we'll just say, right, aircon come in if the temperature starts to drift above, say, 26.5, bring it back down, and it'll operate for 15 minutes once every 6 days for like 5 minutes at a time, and we'll be perfectly comfortable in the hottest weather, So I feel like that's a really great solution in warm climates, is that, with climate change, I think it's a sad reality that we should have air conditioning in Australian houses. Like there will be heat waves. Even a passive house will overheat when conditions are that unfavourable, when it's 40 during the day and it doesn't get below 26 at night, which is what happens in Sydney summers.
But you've shown that you can do that and power it all with your own power and then some.
That's right, and our first 2 energy bills were credits from the energy company. The first one was $50 back from me.
And that was winter,
the next
right?
one was $100 back from me. Yeah, and this is when we expect our energy consumption to be the highest, really, in that it's the time when our solar panels are probably generating the least amount of power that they will through the course of the year, and it's a time when we're doing, where we thought we would be doing heating, we're really not doing.
I was going to ask you about bills. So you haven't actually paid anything out for.
No, and I don't think I ever will. Actually, we've got a really oversized solar system. It's 20 kilowatts, so it's really big. The average size system going in today is probably 6 kilowatts for a big home. 6 to 10, 15 is like probably the biggest you'd see. So 20 is really quite big. But
any battery storage?
Not yet, but I definitely plan to do battery storage, and that's why I've got a big solar array.
Right.
Is that I plan to have the batteries on the wall and sign up to a community power program, a virtual power plant as they're known, and be trading electricity into the grid at times of peak demand and earning revenue. I was inspired by Valbonne. I don't know if you know this very sustainable settlement in Freiburg in Germany that was built in 1999, 2000, and I visited there many years ago and was just totally inspired by that. And one of the things that I really liked was that someone told me that each resident of these houses earns 6,000 euros per year from the export of solar energy. And it's that A, they don't have energy bills, B, the house is a source of income for them from an energy perspective. And I thought, that's how it should be. I want that.
And how much more sun does Sydney get than Freiburg?
Exactly. And, I was actually really inspired by the form factor and the design of those buildings. I really did model my house on those terrace rows of Freiburg. And for me, that is like the perfect urban community. It's just, it was built in 2000. It's been 21 years. I've never seen anything better.
Is there anything you do differently if you were to do this project again?
Oh, look, a lot of people ask me that question, and honestly, no. We thought hard about it, and for me, this is the dream house. This is the perfect house. I absolutely love it.
Is it a good model for others in Australia?
I do think so, because this form factor could easily be a terrace road. And as a freestanding house, we're lucky in that we've got quite a wide block. It's 18.5 metres wide at the front. So we were able to put the the garage external to the building envelope. And so that's great from a sort of pure passive house perspective. You've got a perfect rectangle with, no sort of, thermal issues around a garage and having to insulate around the garage roof and things as part of the form factor of the building. So that's a luxury, I think. In most new build houses, probably the garage would form some sort of part of the building envelope and you'd have to figure out those details. So that's perhaps not as replicable due to the generous width of our block.
Yeah.
But I think in all other respects, it's a great typology. Keep it simple. I think it looks great. Yes, it's a box, but for me, it's a very pretty box. I like it, and ultimately, it's not about the way a building looks. It's about the way a building performs for the people inside. It's there for us to live in. It's not there for architects to have in a magazine and drool over. It's the purpose of it is our comfort, not their aesthetic pleasure.
Did you look at cost premium in what you would have spent over and above to make it a passive house premium if you were just to do a regular build of a similar size?
Yeah, that is the magic question. We haven't done the full analysis yet, but it all depends on what you take as your baseline or benchmark.
Yeah.
If your benchmark is a new building built to the minimum National Construction Code in Australia by a volume builder, then yes, this is an expensive building by comparison, but that's not a fair benchmark. If you take a bespoke architect-designed custom builder product and then you add the passive house components, then we expect the premium is in the order of sort of 5% because you've got a membrane, you've got an MVHR, and MVHR is actually not that dissimilar to installing a big ducted air conditioning system, which is a feature of many homes. So I really think you can sort of net that out and say, look, there's some ductwork and there's a box, but it's the same as what you'd be doing with a big aircon in a poorer performing house. And then you've got the membrane, which is like, okay, there's a little bit of materials cost and there's a fair bit of labour time around that. But look, I don't think it's huge. International studies have shown ranges that average about 0 to 8%. So for what you get a building that works.
Yeah,
I think that's
significant.
It's not really talked about as much as it should be, but passive house works and naturally ventilated houses, they don't work. The concept of I have adequate air through opening and closing windows is a myth. People do not open and close windows as much as they say they do. There are studies that show due to crime, due to noise, due to air pollution, due to not being home, due to it being cold or too hot outside, people don't open the windows. They have the air conditioning on, and therefore there is no ventilation in most of these so-called naturally ventilated houses.
I think that's a really critical point. In your case, the National Construction Code, in our case, our building code, people would assume quite fairly that that'll look after you and that'll provide a fit-for-purpose building if you follow the minimum requirements of those, but they won't.
That's right. There's a lot of assumptions there that just do not stack up in reality. So I think everyone knows that it gets stuffy in houses where you rely on a natural ventilation strategy over winter when you've got heating on. And, when you've got cooling on, you've got cooling, but you don't have ventilation. So the first thing about a passive house is you have effective ventilation, filtered fresh air, continuously supplied at 8 litres per second per person all year round. It is a nice place to be. And of course, then the temperature is perfect all year round versus a normal house where it's freezing cold in Sydney and baking hot in summer. So I think the first thing is you've paid for a product that actually works. And would you pay 5% more for a product that worked versus a product that didn't work? That's the value proposition. It's not, should I pay 5% more? It's, in any other field of life, would you spend $1,000 on an iPhone that actually didn't work? Versus $1,100 on an iPhone that did work? It's you would choose the one that worked, right?
Let alone the money that it's now giving you in feed-in tariff.
Exactly. Then because most people are talking about value for money in terms of energy payback. And yes, there is an energy payback. Yeah, this is, 90% lower electricity costs on heating and cooling than a conventional house. And probably that equates with all the plug loads and et cetera, fridges and things to, half the energy consumption of a conventional house. So yes, it is way more efficient, but it's not about the energy payback. It's about the fact that it's comfortable and it won't give you a respiratory illness.
significant. That's important. And like you say, often missed or assumed that that's just going to be the case. But
yeah, and you get into this reductivist conversation about paybacks, and it's like, well, no, it's not about paybacks. If you were going to go to a car dealer and buy a car that had no wheels versus a car that had wheels, you would choose the one that had the wheels and that did the job, right? And I think that's the thing that we've got to train the market in. Like,
totally,
these houses are fundamentally different because they actually work.
Yeah. We've spent a lot of time talking about your house, which is awesome, but we haven't spent any time talking about you. We might have to get you back on the show to talk about a bit more about you, but just briefly, you're in a very good position to talk about the state of passive houses in Australia and your role as chair of the Australian Passive House Association. Where are things going? What's the future next 5 years, say, for passive house in Australia? What does it look like?
I think it's super exciting, actually. I think we're starting to have demonstration projects like mine and the other sort of 30-odd buildings in Australia where people can kick the tyres and walk through and palpably feel the qualitative differences that passive house delivers. And, already we're seeing a big pickup in the number of residential houses, bespoke architect design residential houses choosing to be passive house, which is great. But I think the really exciting thing is the scale projects. And for me personally, in my job as working in sustainability for a real estate company, the prospect of a institutionally owned build to rent market of medium density and large scale passive house apartment buildings, that's what I find really exciting, is that that's going to help with affordable housing. It's going to help with quality of rental accommodation in our cities. And it's going to bring passive house to a much greater range of people. And I think it's really well suited to that institutional ownership model where, the institutional ownership model of build to rent overcomes the classic split incentive, which is that it is in the builder's interests to build the lowest possible quality product that meets the building code, that is not unlawful. And many of the times it doesn't meet the code and it is unlawful, but they sell it anyway. And that's what you get. And sell that for the highest possible price. They do not have the comfort and the energy bills of the consumer in mind. Like, that is not part of their consideration. They just have to get the product out the door for the lowest possible cost. Institutional owners care very much about the occupant experience because they need to rent out the building again and they need to maintain it and they need to operate it at a low cost. So all of a sudden, with institutional ownership of residential apartment buildings, you get this alignment of the residents' interests with the owner's interests for the first time. And so there is a reason to spend the extra 5% on passive house because you will have lower vacancy rates. You will be able to charge higher rents. You will have a higher building value. You will have lower outgoings. You might be able to market your build-to-rent passive house building as having no energy costs. They might be so negligible that you can just absorb them as part of people's rent. And so what a nice proposition. You can just pay the rent and your energy comes with that. Like, that's good. That's a better future. So I'm really excited about that, about the scale of passive house, both in the residential market and for other building types like education buildings in particular, schools and hospitals, where the health benefits of the stable temperatures and the great air quality will really benefit, educational outcomes and people's health recovery times. So I think it's a really exciting future where we'll start to see passive house scale, not just in the residential market, but in other building types as well.
Look forward to that happening. Thank you, Chris. I know you're a busy man. You got a lot going on, so I really appreciate your time. And thanks for putting the videos together as well. And it's good. I love it when people stick a time lapse camera out of their building site for a few weeks. Makes for a great little video and a really nice walkthrough that people can check up. And of course, you've got some pictures. You got Facebook pictures of the build process as well?
Yes, we do. Through the Passive House Association of Australia, there's been some case studies on it, and we'll continue to, do more with the collateral that I've built. There's lots of photos, there's lots of videos that we haven't fully, made public yet. So we'll keep releasing them and keep telling the story.
And yeah, I'm really interested to see how summer goes. I think that's a story that we need to keep telling in this part of the world and other parts of the world where we're getting more passive houses being built in warmer, humid climates, just to see how that goes. And things that we can learn from that. There's a lot of talk about that 10% allowance of exceeding 25 degrees probably being too much, and I think that's probably right, because that you remember that 10%. That's quite significant, and it's quite uncomfortable. So, I think Australia is well placed there.
It's coming from a European climate where they don't have air conditioning. Their key problem is heating. They don't put air conditioners in, and therefore they get overheating in summer because A, they're not used to doing external shading, and B, they don't have air conditioners. In Australia, we're actually quite good at external shading, and we always put air conditioners in our houses. So we're going to be fine in summer in a passive house.
Yeah,
I'm not worried.
No, well, I guess the concern is that we're getting a more modern, boxy houses with lots of no eaves and lots of west-facing windows, and then people putting louver shutters on the inside or putting relying on internal blinds, not really understanding the physics and not having PHPP. Is a big part of the problem. So if we can get those tools in front of more people and start to educate more designers about some of these aspects, then I think that's the way forward.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, I don't think that's going to be a problem with the passive house community, though. They're well onto those factors.
That's right, and all the better for having examples like yours. Hey, thanks a lot, Chris. Been a pleasure.
Yeah.
We will be in touch and hopefully get to have our South Pacific conference at some stage.
Yeah, look forward to it. Thank you.
All right.
Cheers.
Chris Nunn there, who was the chair of the Australian Passive House Association, and he has been succeeded by Kate, who's another former guest on our show. And they're continuing to go in great leaps and bounds, and there is a really strong uptake of all types of passive house across Australia. But specific to Chris and his projects, what did you think of that, Zach?
Well, it was project number 38, I think, right, in Australia, and I feel like we've heard about a lot of the other 38 that he spoke about, which has been really great. So thank you for your network and connecting with these wonderful leaders. It was a great conversation. I was really struck by a number of things, and maybe starting with the uninsulated slab and the fact that he's able to harness the building science and the software, as he said, of passive house design to come up with a really a surprising and powerful solution in Sydney for his house that insulated.
Very surprising.
The fact that it's and he's already been through a winter, so we know it's working. As the summer kicks in for you all, that cooling effect of the concrete slab should be really nice.
I've been a big advocate for insulating slabs for a long time. I get on a bit of a soapbox about that, particularly about insulating the edge, because there's some heat loss there, but there's also a real danger for having a thermal bridge. And the issue with that is that it leads to condensation, often underneath carpets and around the edges of the buildings. And that can happen just as much in a new building as it can in an older building. So I was very surprised. It took me a little while to get my head around the fact that in this particular case, it could actually be advantageous to or inconsequential to not insulate the slab. And really that points to the idea of location-specific solutions to achieve this global performance criteria or standard, which is passive house. And that's a beautiful thing to have the standard that is global, but can be achieved, and those parameters can be achieved and need to be achieved by very location-specific solutions.
Right. I felt like the same logic also applies to the conversation of the whether to retrofit or do tear down. As I was listening to Sam speak about in the Sydney and probably elsewhere in Australia and maybe in New Zealand, his argument that it probably just makes more sense to just tear these places down because they're just so bad. The existing housing and building stock is so bad. As he was saying that, I was thinking about the fact that the context really matters. So that decision about whether to tear down or retrofit is probably a really different one in North America, in Europe, just depending on the baseline situation of the quality of the housing and whether it makes sense to invest in that housing. And so as we're thinking about, and really this gets to that question of upfront emissions or embodied carbon, right? Of whether, and as we grapple with that, I think that question of embodied carbon and retrofits, we need to be thinking about, the location specific problems and solutions. And so I just want to point to like the work that both PHI and FIAS are doing in thinking about this stuff and in solution making and around it. PHI has the EnerFit standard, of course, but also Outfit, which is bringing the EnerFit, the rigor of EnerFit to the energy strong approach of wrapping buildings with kind of a tea cozy, to borrow from BD Passive, to retrofit. And then FIAS has been doing some interesting work with our revive standard. Graham Wright in particular has this calculation that he's dubbed ADORB, ADORB, and maybe I'll look up what that stands for again and put it into the show notes. It's a pretty clever acronym, but really what that's meant to do is to really analyze what's the smartest carbon investment with existing buildings, and how far should we go with that deep retrofits, and where when does it make sense? Probably in some ways may address that question of retrofit or tear down, but really it's about that optimizing question, and what's the smartest move for us to make around carbon with existing buildings.
Annualized decarbonisation of retrofit building costs.
Thank you. Yeah, and so in order to connect it to carbon, he's looking at a cost of carbon and assigning a dollar value to that, and then using dollars as a way to guide the thinking. It's pretty cool.
And in terms of tearing things down, a big part of that is what you do with that material.
True.
Whether you can sell the house, put the house on a truck, move it to somewhere else. That's great. Reuse of that resource. Are there beautiful? There's quite often timber in these old buildings that could be reused. But I think the underlying principle is that site-specific decision making and figuring out what's best in that situation. For a variety of factors, not necessarily just going with the cheapest and easiest, which might be to put a bulldozer through it and send everything to landfill, which doesn't really help anyone.
Right.
And the final thing for me, it was a big issue or big point that Chris made about accessible design and making it so that it's not an issue for the aesthetic. And you good accessible design, I think, is invisible. It's not a big wheelchair ramp that's stuck onto the outside of a building. It's good landscaping that means that it's level entry access from the roadway or the footpath or the car parking area to the front door. And it's not just about wheelchairs. I think that people have this perception of accessible design being about wheelchairs. It's about carrying your groceries easily from the car or from the footpath to the front door. It's about little kids being able to navigate that, and it's about someone. I've had a sports injury where I've been on crutches and have appreciated things like good door handles and just good movement spaces inside the house. It's just good design, and I really like this example that Chris has created of good design, which also incorporates some pretty fancy engineering solutions like a doorway that seals with an airtight seal, but also has no threshold. And that sounds simple if you haven't actually had to face that challenge, but to achieve that, there are some challenges. But it's great to know that there's these products and solutions available to do that. So a really good example of design that looks simple, but has actually had a lot of thought go into it to kind of make it look more simple than what is perhaps hidden in the thinking.
I enjoyed Sam's gratitude toward the engineering and engineers who are solving these problems before they become, kind of before each of us encounters them.
We don't even know that they're a problem.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a cool place to be in terms of the development of all this industry. So we are at a place where, we've got a solution for that. I don't know if you in New Zealand and Australia, if you have the term universal design.
It is becoming more, and I do like that term because it's just good design. It's not focusing on a certain cohort of people that have certain needs. It's saying it's universal. Right. Good design should be for everyone.
Yeah, no, definitely, that's good stuff.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's definitely. I know we probably have to wrap up, but I felt like his point that naturally ventilated houses don't work was a really important one.
That's an important message for Australia.
Yeah, definitely for Seattle. It maybe a decade ago, naturally ventilation works, but not with the wildfires anymore. It's not.
Yeah, wildfires, and the fact that when we have quite a few still days where it's warm and humid, and you can open the windows as much all you like. You're just not going to get much airflow through there. And even worse when in those old days where we used to go somewhere else to go to work, and the house was all closed up during the day. We might even return to those days. And when we do, how's the house going to be when it's closed up all day? And it's 40 degrees Celsius in the middle of the day, natural ventilation is not going to be much help.
No.
So those concepts of good ventilation, good air tightness, good insulation, like I said at the front end, are just as important for keeping cool as they are for keeping warm.
Well said.
Awesome. All right. Well, we don't have a regular list of events at the moment because we're all chilling out on a break. But there will be newsletters coming out, and a good place, as always, to stay connected is on the Passive House Accelerator website. So check that out for what's going on.
Yep. We'll be back to Construction Tech on January 11th and Showcase on January 12th. So we'll be back at it.
Great. We'll see you then. Thanks, Zach.
Thank you, Matthew.